Aquí estamos.
Ya estamos aquí a unos minutos de iniciar una de las ponencias más esperadas por todos nosotros. Muy emocionados de estar aquí en este congreso. Ya va a ser la 1 de la tarde. Vamos a esperar unos segundos para que la gente se conecte ahí con nosotros. Hay que recordarles que la siguiente ponencia estará en su idioma inglés, en el idioma original del ponente, y posteriormente la iremos a traducir en los próximos días para que estén ahí, para que no tengan preocupación alguna. Y pues vamos a esperar unos cuantos segundos.
No, igual los que saben inglés de aquí, el doctor Forbes habla inglés muy, no sé, muy bonito, muy fluido, muy fácil,
Claro.
muy fácil de entender,
Claro.
sí, muy claro. Y pues, no sé, ¿quieren que diga como su currículum?
Sí.
Ya.
Por favor.
Bueno, es que es muy largo, es como de
No,
30 páginas, pero
lo más principal.
lo más resumido.
Hay que hacer hincapié que para nosotros es un gran logro como equipo en este congreso, como lo habíamos dicho anteriormente en la mañana, que en el congreso pasado, pues nuestros compañeros y nuestros colegas que son divulgadores de la ciencia, pues nos han ayudado a poder compartir su conocimiento, y que el día de hoy para nosotros es como un triunfo como equipo, y para la comunidad de nutriólogos, en esta cuestión, el poder presentar a un ponente internacional, el poder presentar a un ponente que tenga que ver con la línea de investigación científica. Y pues vamos a presentar al doctor Scott Forbes.
Sí, antes que nada, chicos, creo que Facebook tiene traductor automático.
Okay.
Pueden meterse a Facebook y creo que si tienen en cualquier equipo, pueden ver el traductor. A ver, ¿no es algo? Aquí estamos. Pueden ver el traductor y aquí se traduce automáticamente. Le dan a la parte de los 3 puntos y pueden traducirlo. Miren, activar traducción automática en comentarios. Obviamente va a estar en inglés, ustedes lo pueden traducir, ¿va? Así que para avisar en el grupo. Pues sin más y menos, pues presentamos a el doctor Scott Forbes. Hi, doctor.
Vamos a presentar su currículum, vamos a hablar.
Hi, doctor.
Hello.
I will say your curriculum in Spanish, and
Okay.
then you start, okay?
Okay, sounds great.
Bueno, el doctor Forbes es un profesor asociado en el Departamento de Estudios de Educación Física en la Universidad de Brandon, en Manitoba, Canadá, y es profesor adjunto de la Facultad de Kinesiología y Estudios de Salud en la Universidad de Regina, Canadá. El doctor Forbes es nutriólogo deportivo certificado por la Sociedad Internacional de Nutrición Deportiva, o se conoce como el ISSN. El doctor Forbes es fisiólogo clínico del ejercicio y especialista de alto rendimiento por la Sociedad Canadiense de Fisiología del Ejercicio. Además, el doctor Forbes ha publicado más de 138, hace rato que chequé en ResearchGate, manuscritos o papeles revisados por pares, o sea, son papeles de alta calidad, ¿no? Y 5 capítulos de varios libros. Y su investigación examina o evalúa varias intervenciones nutricionales, como creatina, más que nada, y proteína, y de ejercicio para mejorar la función muscular, ósea y cognitiva en varias poblaciones, como atletas y adultos mayores.
Perfecto.
So, doctor, we just found a translator in this platform, so it's going to be so much better. So you can talk in English and it will translate automatically.
Awesome. Sounds great.
That's awesome. So you can start, Professor.
Welcome. Bienvenido.
So thank you very much for the opportunity to present. I hope one day I can go to Mexico. In Canada, it's still snowing. It's still cold. So it would be nice to go to a warm country. But I'm happy today to present on creatine supplementation. I've been studying creatine for quite a few years now, and there's lots of benefits to creatine supplementation across the lifespan. And that's what I'm going to highlight today is really how creatine works, what it does, and how it can influence different tissues in your body. So just before I start, I do have a few conflicts of interest. I was a scientific advisor for a supplement company that sold creatine, but that company does not exist anymore. And so that's not really a continuing conflict of interest. And I have received creatine donations for research purposes. And I do sell creatine educational videos as well. So I do make money from those educational videos, although it's a very small amount. But really, my biggest conflict of interest is that I love the science. And on social media, I have arguments with people sometimes. And usually I'm trying to present the actual science. And so that's what I really try to follow is the science. And that's my biggest conflict of interest, is that I really, really love the science. But today I have three main objectives. One, I'm going to tell you what creatine is and how it works, because it's a little bit more complicated than what people think. And then I'm going to provide some of the evidence, some of the latest evidence on how creatine can impact your muscles, your bones, and your brain tissue. So there's lots of benefits to creatine supplementation. And then at the end of the presentation, I'm going to briefly examine the safety of creatine. So this is a question that I get quite commonly is creatine actually safe? So I'm going to highlight a few really recent and important studies that have shown the safety of creatine. So that is my third objective of the presentation. So first, I just want to mention that creatine is not new. The first person to identify creatine was in 1832. So almost 200 years ago, it was first identified. And the first human study where they used creatine supplementation was done in 1926. So that was 97 years ago that creatine supplementation research began. So creatine is not new, and we've known about creatine or been studying creatine for a very long period of time. But there's still lots of myths and misconceptions about creatine. And one of them is that people think that creatine is a steroid. So in fact, we wrote it's a scientific paper, but it's more of a blog paper because we answer some of these common questions with creatine. And one of the questions is creatine a steroid? And we conclude in that particular paper that creatine has a completely different chemical structure, and it is not an anabolic steroid. And so this was published in a paper that was led by Dr. Antonio, Darren Kando, myself, and there's about 10 other authors, and this was published in 2021. So what is creatine? It's actually derived of 3 different amino acids, and amino acids are the building blocks of protein. So anytime you consume protein, you're consuming amino acids. So the 3 amino acids are arginine, glycine, and methionine. And your body can synthesize creatine. So your body can make its own creatine. This is primarily in your liver and kidneys, but your brain could actually make its own creatine as well. And then once you get creatine into the bloodstream, 95% of it is taken up into the muscle, and 2/3 of that is converted into phosphocreatine. And phosphocreatine is stored potential energy. So if you perform intense exercise, such as lifting weights or sprinting upstairs, then you can utilize this particular energy system to make ATP or energy within the muscle. And this can help fuel muscle contraction and muscle performance. We also know that creatine is non-enzymatically degraded into creatinine. And so we lose about 2 grams per day. So we need to replace that just to maintain muscle stores of creatine. So our bodies can synthesize creatine, but we can also get creatine in food as well. And most studies use 5 grams of creatine, most supplementation studies. And to achieve that with food, I'm going to show you how challenging that is. So if you want to consume cod, then you would have to consume 3.5 pounds of cod just to get 5 grams of creatine. If you want to do it with beef, 3.33 pounds of beef, or milk, 100 pounds of milk or 200 cups of milk, or 2.5 pounds of salmon, just to get 5 grams of creatine. And so you can see that, yes, it is possible to get creatine from these food sources, but it's very challenging to get a lot of creatine from our diet alone. And this is why omnivores, so those that consume meat, and vegetarians, those that don't consume meat, tend to respond to creatine supplementation, because it's so challenging to saturate your muscles with food sources alone. And so one of the first studies that was published looking at how much creatine we actually need to saturate our muscles with creatine was done by Eric Haltman and Paul Greenhoff in 1996. And what they found was that if you take 20 grams of creatine per day and you do this for 6 days, that's going to saturate your muscles with creatine. So it completely fills your muscles with creatine. And then in this particular study, they just went on a maintenance dose of 2 grams per day. And they showed that that maintenance dose was effective to maintain saturation. So they took 20 grams per day for 6 days, saturated the muscles, and then they took 2 grams per day. And over the next 28 days, they were able to maintain those saturated levels. In this particular study, they also showed that if you take 20 grams per day for 6 days, you saturate your muscles with creatine. But if you stop taking creatine, it slowly goes back down to baseline. And it actually takes between 4 to 6 weeks for creatine stores to return to baseline. And so this is why some people might cycle on and off creatine every 4 weeks, is because it takes a while for creatine stores to return to baseline after you saturated your muscles. And then also in this study, they looked at just taking 3 grams of creatine per day, and they found that it took a little bit longer, but they were able to saturate their muscles to the same extent as doing that 20 grams per day for 6 days. So it just took a little bit longer to do so. So it took 28 days to get that 20% increase in muscle total creatine concentration. So there's lots of different strategies that you can do to saturate your muscles with creatine. You can take 20 grams per day for 5 to 7 days or 6 days, as shown in the Haltman study. And then you can do a maintenance dose of just 2 to 5 grams per day. And that will maintain your creatine stores within the muscle. Or you can do that low dose strategy where you just take 3 grams per day for 28 days. And that's going to lead to a 20% increase in muscle creatine content. So they're both really, really effective strategies. Another strategy that's commonly used and what we use mainly in our laboratory is what I call the Kandau method. So here's a picture of Dr. Darren Kandau, who uses this relative dosing strategy. So it's 0.1 grams of creatine per kilogram of body weight per day. And it's kind of like a moderate dose. It's higher than the low dose, and it's not as high as the loading phase that's typically recommended. So it's kind of a moderate dosing protocol. But we know that that dose is a very effective dose to enhance muscle performance. And we also know that it might be more effective to take this dose to enhance other tissues such as bone and brain health. And I'll get to that later in the presentation. We also know that if you combine creatine with carbohydrates and or protein, that it could actually help with creatine uptake. So if you want to maximize creatine uptake, and do that as quickly as possible, then I suggest to combine creatine with your protein shake or combine creatine with a carbohydrate. And the reason why is both protein and carbohydrates are going to stimulate insulin, and that's going to help with creatine uptake. But as I mentioned, this Kando method seems to be the preferred method to enhance bone tissue and brain tissue, whereas all three strategies mentioned here can be equally effective from a muscle performance standpoint. Well, how does creatine actually work? As I mentioned, it's fairly complicated within a cell what it's actually doing, but it can increase muscle anabolic processes and it can decrease muscle catabolic processes. So anabolic processes are like when you're trying to build the muscle, and catabolic is when it's breaking down. So it can actually slow the breakdown of muscle tissue. So here's an image of a muscle cell right here. And you can see that creatine can increase the amount of phosphocreatine that you have in the muscle. And that's going to help with that high intensity energy system. But you can also see that creatine also brings, when co-ingested with carbohydrates, can bring in more glycogen. And those can be both used as fuels. And if you have more energy in the muscle, you can exercise a little bit harder. And that could lead to bigger and stronger muscles over time. We also know that creatine can act as an antioxidant. So it can actually reduce ROS, or reactive oxygen species. We know that creatine can stimulate IGF-1, which is an anabolic hormone that can lead to a cascade of events that can ultimately increase mTOR. And that's the main substrate controlling muscle protein synthesis, or the building of muscle. And then we know that creatine can also stimulate what's known as myogenic regulatory factors. And these are important to activate satellite cells. And satellite cells increase the number of nuclei within the muscle. And that essentially increases the muscle capacity to grow. And then we also know that creatine can inhibit myostatin as well. And myostatin actually tries to block these satellite cell activations. So if you can block something that's trying to inhibit satellite cell activation, that can lead to muscle growth over time as well. Basically, from this slide, you can see that there are a lot of different mechanisms whereby creatine can actually enhance muscle performance. So this particular study showed that just taking creatine for 7 days, and they performed that loading phase of 20 grams per day for 7 days, what they actually found was that when you did that, it brought a lot of water into the muscle cell. So there was an increase in intracellular water uptake. And what they found was that water uptake caused the muscle to swell, and it stimulated a whole bunch of things within the muscle that lead to muscle growth over time. So you might have heard from people that creatine just causes water to be brought into the muscle cell. That is true, but that increase in water retention within the muscle actually signals the muscle to grow. So that is actually a good thing. And we know that creatine stimulates muscle growth over time. And this particular study, which was done by Brad Schoenfeld and other colleagues around the world, what they actually found was that the ratio of intracellular water to skeletal muscle mass was actually the same following 8 weeks of training compared to at the start of the training program. So what that actually means is that at the start of the training program, what would happen when you start taking creatine is creatine gets into the muscle, that pulls water into the muscle, and that signals the muscle to grow. But after 8 weeks of training, there's the ratio of intracellular water to skeletal muscle mass is the same at the end of the 8 weeks of training. So that is a mechanism that actually stimulates muscle growth. And it may be different or slightly different in females across the menstrual cycle. So this was a recent paper that was done by Abby Smith-Ryan and some of her graduate students. And what they found was that in the luteal phase was when creatine increased water retention, but there was actually no effect of water retention during the follicular phase. So the phase that you're in for the menstrual cycle may actually influence the effectiveness of creatine supplementation and may influence water retention. So we know that creatine can do a lot of things, as I've previously mentioned, but creatine can also reduce catabolic processes. And I'm going to highlight one great study here that was done relatively recently by some of my friends and colleagues. So Dr. Darren Kando, Steve Cornish, who's from the same area in Canada as me, and Dean Cordingley, who's a good friend of mine, and he's currently a PhD student. And what they showed was that creatine has these anti-inflammatory and anti-catabolic effects. So if you want to read about all the anti-catabolic effects or anti-inflammatory effects of creatine supplementation, I highly recommend to read this particular review. So creatine can, in theory, influence muscle performance. And one of my first studies that I wrote with Darren Kando and Phil Chillibeck and Dr. John Little is we gave individuals creatine for 10 days. And we used that dose of 0.1 grams of creatine per kilogram of body weight per day. And we measured their muscular endurance performance. So what we did was a bench press test, and they were asked to lift 70% of their max, and they did as many reps as possible. Once they weren't able to perform any more reps, we gave them 1 minute of rest, and then we asked them to do a second set, as many reps as possible. Counted those reps. They would re-rack it once they couldn't do any more. We would wait 1 minute, and we'd perform the third set. And what we found was that if they supplemented with creatine for 10 days, they were able to do a couple more reps over that 3 sets. So in theory, if you can do a few more reps, you can train a little bit harder. Over time, you can actually get bigger and stronger muscles. So we've also done training studies as well over a longer period of time than just 10 days. In this particular study, it was a 6-week training study. And we found that if they took creatine, that they actually gained increases in total body strength, but also muscle mass as well, compared to placebo. So the group that took the creatine gained more total body strength, whereas there was actually no change over time in the placebo group. So creatine is an effective supplement over time. And that was just in one particular study. So we've done systematic reviews and meta-analyses, and we were the first to do it looking at the combined effects of creatine and resistance training. And this was published in 2014. And we found that if you took creatine, you got bigger and stronger muscles. And this was replicated by another lab from Stu Phillips and DeVries as well, that showed the same thing, that if you take creatine and you perform resistance training in older adults, that it can enhance muscle mass and muscle strength adaptations. This was updated in 2017 by Phil Chillibeck. And again, the same conclusion, that creatine is an effective supplement to enhance resistance training adaptations. You can get bigger and stronger muscles if you take creatine. We've updated that meta-analysis in 2021. And the conclusion is that creatine is an effective supplement to enhance muscle mass and strength adaptations. So here's the results for lean tissue mass. And also in this review, we also looked at whether taking 5 grams or less of creatine, or more than 5 grams of creatine, does that influence the findings? And what we found was actually both those supplement dosing strategies, 5 grams or less of creatine per day, or more than 5 grams of creatine per day, are equally effective. And overall, creatine works. So it's going to help you build more muscle mass. We also found that creatine helps with lower body strength, but what you'll see is that it's more effective in the higher dose studies. So maybe a higher dose in older adults is required to enhance lower body strength adaptations. Another thing we looked at in that review was what if you just took creatine on training days? So in these particular studies, they took creatine just on the days that they did their training, which was 3 times per week. And what we found was that it is an effective way to take creatine. So if you just want to take creatine on training days, this is a viable strategy. So future studies are required to look at just taking it on training days compared to every day. But if you just want to take creatine on training days, and I know this is easier for some people from an adherence standpoint, that it is a viable strategy, and it will help you build a little bit more muscle, and it will help you build a little bit more upper and lower body strength. We've also done another systematic review and meta-analysis, not just in older adults, but anyone over the age of 18. And so this actually included 35 different randomized controlled trials with nearly 1,200 participants. And what we found, again, is that creatine increases whole body muscle mass. But there was 3 kind of really important things from this study. One was that creatine supplementation must be combined with resistance training. So if you want to get bigger and stronger muscles and you just want to sit at home on your couch and take creatine, it is not going to work. You have to take creatine and go to the gym to get the benefits of creatine supplementation. Number 2, we found that creatine works in both young and older adults. Number 3, we actually found that males supplementing with creatine experience greater gains in muscle mass compared to females. So it's not saying that females should not take creatine. We know that creatine can be effective in females, but it has a lesser effect compared to males. And that was pretty interesting from this particular review. So another really recent paper that's currently under review, so I can't show you the actual evidence yet. Hopefully it will be published relatively soon. But we looked at, in this particular review, direct measures of hypertrophy. So we know that if you look at whole body measures of muscle growth or lean tissue mass, there could be some effects from water retention. So we wanted to look at direct measures of hypertrophy. So we used just studies that used ultrasound, for example, or PQCT, computed tomography. And we also wanted to look at regional differences. So does creatine influence upper body versus lower body, or elbow flexors versus elbow extensors differently? And what we found was that it was equally effective in the upper and lower body. And using these direct measures of hypertrophy, creatine was an effective supplement. We also know that creatine can influence what's known as sit-to-stand performance. So your ability to stand up from a chair and sit back down multiple times. And this was in older adults. And the reason why this is so exciting is because this sit-to-stand performance has been used as an indicator of falls. So if you perform poorly on the sit-to-stand test, you are more likely to fall. So we have some evidence that creatine supplementation can improve muscle performance in older adults, but also function and their sit-to-stand performance. We also know that creatine, the effectiveness of creatine can differ from one person to the next. And we wrote a nice review looking at all the variables that can influence the effectiveness of creatine supplementation. This was focused on older adults, but the results are similar for younger population as well. And I'm going to highlight one study here that was done by Dr. Dan Siratak and Dr. Gordon Bell in 2004. And they looked at responders and non-responders to creatine supplementation from a muscle performance level. And what they found was that there was two really important characteristics that determined responsiveness to creatine supplementation. So one was if you had a low amount of creatine within the muscle to begin with, then you tended to respond better to creatine supplementation. And this is why there's evidence that vegetarians have lower levels of creatine in their muscles, and they tend to respond better to creatine supplementation. And in theory, older adults might have lower amounts of creatine within their muscle. And so from this perspective, they might be more responsive to creatine supplementation. But the other factor that determined responsiveness to creatine supplementation was your fiber type distribution. So the responders had, on average, about 65% type 2 muscle fibers, those fast twitch muscle fibers, whereas the non-responders had a lower amount of type 2 muscle fibers. They had about 35%. And so if you have more fast twitch fibers, you tend to respond more favorably to creatine supplementation. We also know that as you age, you tend to lose those type 2 muscle fibers, and that might actually reduce the effectiveness of creatine supplementation. So we need to kind of do more research to look at older versus younger populations to see if those populations differ with regards to their response to creatine supplementation. But these are the two main factors that determine responsiveness: how much creatine you have in your muscles to begin with, and your fiber type distribution. So when's the best time to take creatine? Again, we've recently addressed this question in a narrative review, and it was led by Dr. Darren Kando and written with myself, but Jose Antonio, Mike Roberts, a couple of Brazilians, Bruno Guilano, Hamilton Rochelle, Abby Smith-Ryan, and Eric Rawson. So a lot of really smart people in the creatine world. But essentially, I'm going to highlight some of the main research in this particular area. So the first study to look at creatine timing was actually done in 2006 by Paul Cribb. And what they did was they had two different groups. So they had one group that took half of this creatine-containing supplement in the morning. They had to wait 5 hours, and then they performed their resistance training session. They had to wait another 5 hours, and then they got the second half of their supplement. So that was one group. Another group got this creatine-containing supplement immediately before they trained, half of it before. Then they did their training session, and they got the second half of their supplement just after. They trained for 10 weeks. And what they found was the group that got the creatine close to their training session had greater improvements in body composition and muscle performance. So the open bars here is the group that got creatine pre-post. So just before and just after their training, they had greater gains in lean body mass. So they gained more muscle mass over that 10-week training period compared to the group that did the same training but got the supplement in the morning and evening. They also showed that that group that got the supplement close to their training session lost a significantly greater amount of percent body fat as well. So this was some evidence that taking creatine close to your training session is of benefit. But we wanted to know whether taking creatine just before training or after training was any different, or is there no difference at all? So we actually did a within subject design study. And what that means was basically we cut the person in half here. So they trained one side of their body one day and the other side of their body the next day. So each side of their body trained twice per week. The only difference was one side of their body got creatine before training and the other side of their body got creatine after training. We used an ultrasound to look at changes in muscle growth or muscle hypertrophy. And then we used just dumbbells and a leg extension machine to look at changes in muscular strength. And what we found was that they led to similar changes in muscle thickness or muscle hypertrophy, whether you took creatine before training or after training. So there's no difference from a timing perspective. So if you take creatine before or after training, they are equally as effective from a muscle building standpoint and also a muscle strength standpoint. So take creatine close to your training session, but whether you take it before training or after training makes no difference. So what's the best type of creatine? This question has been up for debate for quite a few years as well. And there was a recent review that was published in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research. And basically the conclusion was that creatine monohydrate is the best form of creatine for a few reasons. One, it's the most researched. We know it's effective, and we know that it's very, very safe. So this is kind of the best form of creatine based off the scientific literature. And the other benefit of creatine monohydrate is it's actually the cheapest form of creatine as well. So if you go to a supplement store, they might try to sell you some of these more expensive forms of creatine, but there's actually right now the evidence suggests that creatine monohydrate is the best. And I get a lot of questions about creatine HCl or creatine hydrochloride versus creatine monohydrate. And there was a nice review that was published by Rick Kreider and Ralph Yager and Purpura that was recently published in a nice special issue in Nutrients. And they examined basically the effectiveness of all these different creatine compounds. And in particular, I'm going to highlight creatine HCl versus creatine monohydrate. So there's no evidence that creatine HCl is absorbed more effectively than creatine monohydrate in humans. So if somebody says that, there is currently no evidence to support that. There's no evidence that creatine HCl promotes greater muscle creatine retention than creatine monohydrate. And there's no evidence that lower doses of creatine HCl are as effective as standard supplementation protocols with creatine monohydrate. So these are common claims that I see on social media. And currently there is absolutely no scientific evidence to support those claims. So currently creatine monohydrate is the best form of creatine. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit. Hopefully I've convinced you so far that creatine combined with resistance training is an effective supplement to enhance muscle mass and strength adaptations. But creatine can also influence other tissues in your body as well. So creatine can possibly influence bone. And the way that it can do this is through indirect effects. So again, if you take creatine and you perform resistance training, you can get bigger and stronger muscles. Well, those muscles, they pull on the bone, and that's going to stress the bone, and that can lead to positive bone adaptations over time. We also know that there can be some direct effects. So Dr. Walliman has shown in cell cultures that if you put some creatine on osteoblasts. Osteoblasts are the bone-forming cells that can increase the activity of those osteoblasts. So you can actually have a direct effect of creatine to enhance bone adaptation. So we did a review in 2018, and there was only limited studies at that time, but there was kind of two key findings from that review. One is bone turnover is quite slow. So it takes about 9 months to detect meaningful changes. And we also found that studies that had a higher frequency of training may be an important factor to stimulate muscle growth as well. So if you train 3 times or more per week, then it seems like you got greater increases in bone adaptations compared to the studies that just trained 1 or 2 times a week. So here's one study that was actually done in postmenopausal women and kind of met that criteria. So it was 12 months in duration, so it was greater than 9 months, and they trained 3 times per week. And what they found was there was, this is the change in femoral neck bone mineral density. So the bone in your hip. And what they found was in the placebo group, there was quite a large drop in this bone mineral density, even though they were training 3 times a week. If they took creatine, it attenuated that drop in that femoral neck bone mineral density. So creatine lessened the effects of 12 months of aging on their bones. And so it's better to take creatine to enhance your bone strength. So this was a pretty cool study. It was done in postmenopausal women. I know this group is actually just finishing up a 2-year training study, and they have some positive effects of creatine supplementation on other markers of bone strength. So hopefully that gets published relatively soon. But that group has also published other reviews. This was done in 70 older adults. And again, they found that creatine increased lower leg muscle density, so it increased muscle adaptations. But it also increased distal tibia area, so bone adaptations as well, using a really kind of fancy technique to look at these bone adaptations, peripheral quantitative computed tomography. So there's actually been about 10 studies that have looked at creatine combined with resistance training. And when we looked at these studies, it appears like a higher dose of creatine is actually required. And so if we look at the low dose studies, so that's 5 grams or less, none of those studies actually showed any benefits on bone. But if we look at the high dose studies, so this was using greater than 5 grams of creatine per day, and most of them were done by Kandau and using this 0.1 grams of creatine per kilogram of body weight per day. So 5 of the 6 studies using that dosing protocol found a positive effect on bone. So that's why we think a slightly higher dose of creatine, more than 5 grams per day, in that range of about 10 grams per day, is an effective strategy, not only to enhance muscle performance, but also to influence bone adaptation as well. So hopefully I've convinced you so far that creatine combined with resistance training can enhance muscle performance, but also bone adaptations as well. But creatine can also influence your brain. And so there's your brain is different than your muscle. It can actually synthesize its own creatine, which is pretty cool. But we know that it's a challenge to get creatine across the blood-brain barrier. So it appears like it is possible to do that, but it might require a higher dose of creatine compared to at the muscle level, or you might have to supplement with creatine for a little bit longer period of time to get the brain benefits. So currently, there's actually 12 studies that have looked at taking creatine supplementation and how much creatine you get in your brain. And we reviewed that in a recent review that I wrote with Eric Rawson. He's probably the best in the world with regards to brain creatine effects. And what they found was in these 12 different studies that there was about a 5 to 10% increase in the amount of creatine in your brain following supplementation. Whereas at the muscle level, it's a pretty robust effect of about 20% increase. So it's much easier to get creatine into your muscle compared to creatine into your brain. But there is some evidence that when you do supplement with creatine, you can get more creatine into the brain. There's some evidence in animal models that creatine can influence learning and memory and mitochondrial function in the brain. So this was a 4-week supplementation study by some Canadian researchers, and they found that in a rat model that there was some positive effects of taking creatine. But rats are definitely not humans, and they metabolize creatine much differently than humans. So what about the human studies? So we've recently tried to investigate the effects of creatine supplementation on memory. And what we found was really a robust effect in a small number of studies, but in older adults. So it seems like there is at least limited evidence that creatine can increase memory in an older adult, which is pretty cool. And we also know that when your brain is stressed, that creatine levels go down. And we know that there's some evidence that creatine could be a benefit when your brain is really stressed. A few situations that we can stress your brain is mental fatigue, hypoxia, so a low amount of oxygen. There's also traumatic brain injuries, concussions. Those things can all influence your brain creatine levels, and creatine supplementation can have a greater effect in those particular situations. The one study I'm going to highlight here that shows this is when they performed hypoxia. So they gave them a low amount of oxygen, and in one situation they had creatine, another situation they got placebo. But what they found was if they were getting a low amount of oxygen, their abilities for their brains to function went down. So they measured complex attention, executive function, how quickly you can make decisions, cognitive flexibility, and they had this neurocognitive index. So in the placebo condition, when they got a low amount of oxygen, their abilities for their brain to function went down. But if they supplemented with creatine, it either went down less or sometimes not at all. So it shows the power of creatine, particularly when the brain was stressed, in this case, getting a low amount of oxygen. Another way that the brain might be stressed is following a stroke. And we actually did a small pilot study where we combined creatine with resistance training in stroke survivors. We didn't have enough power to detect any differences from a cognitive function standpoint, but we did show in this population an improved 6-minute walking test with the creatine. So there is some benefit, at least for stroke survivors, based off this small pilot study, that creatine can be an effective supplement. So is creatine safe? This is a question I get quite frequently, and there's lots of opinions on the internet, but the evidence clearly shows that creatine is one of the safest supplements that you can ingest. And we've written a brief commentary on the safety of creatine, which was published, but I'm going to highlight a few really cool studies. The first two are actually from some Brazilians, so Bruno Guilano and Luncia Jr., and they looked at the effects of creatine supplementation on kidney function. Even when consuming a high-protein diet, creatine was a safe supplement to take, and it actually had no negative effects on kidney function. They also did a case study on an individual with a single kidney, and they gave them a high dose of creatine. And again, it had no negative effect on that individual's kidney. So it suggests that creatine does not impair kidney function and does not cause kidney damage. As I mentioned previously, we wrote a review on common questions and misconceptions about creatine. And in this particular review, we answer everything from, does creatine cause baldness? Is creatine bad for your kidneys? Does creatine cause fat mass? All these comments, do you have to load with creatine? Should you cycle on and off creatine? So we answered all those questions in this particular review, and it's open access, which means that you can type in that title of the article and you can read the article for free. I also recently wrote another article on nutritional and non-nutritional strategies in bodybuilding, looking at kidney function. And this was actually written with Ken Farrington, who's a world-renowned nephrologist. And we came to the conclusion that there is no evidence that creatine supplementation is bad for your kidneys. So just to kind of end with some key take-home points, hopefully I've convinced you that creatine combined with resistance training can enhance muscle mass and strength adaptations. Creatine combined with resistance training can enhance bone strength. We know that creatine appears to be an effective strategy to enhance memory, particularly in older adults. But the question mark is because there's only 2 studies to support that. So we need to do more research in that area. And then we know that creatine ingested in the recommended doses is a very safe supplement in healthy individuals. So if you are considering creatine but are nervous about taking creatine from a safety standpoint, the evidence suggests that creatine is the safest supplement that an individual can take, and there are lots of benefits to taking creatine supplementation. So what else can creatine do? There was a nice special issue about creatine for health and clinical diseases. And it was led by Dr. Rick Kreider and Jeff Stout. And if you want to find out all the powers of creatine, I recommend that you go find this particular special issue on the internet. And you can download the entire special issue for free. And there are studies on creatine and diabetes, creatine and heart disease, creatine and endothelial function, creatine during reproduction or pregnancy. There are so many different kind of benefits of creatine supplementation that are reviewed in this particular special issue beyond what I presented today. And just to kind of end this presentation, I just want to highlight that creatine is an effective supplement, but there's other things that are important for health and performance. And so the way that I think of it is building a cake. So you need a good foundation to a cake. And that foundation includes regular exercise. It includes eating lots of fruits and vegetables and sufficient calories. And it includes eating or getting sufficient sleep. I would say those are the 3 most important things from a health perspective: exercising regularly, eating lots of fruits and vegetables, and getting sufficient sleep. That's the foundation. The icing on top of the cake is maybe getting sufficient protein, maybe nutrient timing. Those can all influence performance adaptations. And then creatine is putting sprinkles on top of that cake. So it's not like creatine is going to make the cake amazing. It's going to have a small effect. It's going to have a positive effect to make the cake even better. I love sprinkles, but it's a much smaller effect than what's proposed on social media. People think if you take creatine, you're going to gain tons of muscle and tons of strength. But the reality is that it does help, but it's a much smaller effect than what people suggest on the internet. So it is important. And the way that I think of it is creatine is really the sprinkles on top of the cake. And it's important to remember that you need a good foundation and a good layer of icing before you put that sprinkles on. So I just want to thank you for your time and for paying attention. If you have any questions about creatine, you can feel free to email me at forbes@brandonu.ca, or you can follow me on Instagram, Scott_Forbes_PhD, or you can actually search Dr. Creatine, and you can find me on Instagram that way as well. Thank you.
¿Qué tal, chicos? ¿Cómo están? Thank you, doctor, for your presentation. That was good.
That was awesome.
Awesome. Yeah, very awesome. Thank you. We have some questions, and now we're going to read that.
¿Los puedes proyectar?
Yes.
We can't put them in the screen for you.
Yes. Next.
So the first question is
From Facebook user.
In a 19-year-old swimmer, what is the ideal period of time to take creatine, and what is the optimal time to take it before a competence?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So you can saturate your muscles with creatine relatively quickly. So you can get in 5 to 7 days, your muscles can be completely saturated with creatine. But the way that creatine works is it helps your training. So I would suggest to consume creatine even throughout the year to enhance your training adaptations. So that would be my recommendation, but as little as 5 to 7 days, and you can saturate your muscles with creatine and perhaps get some benefits. And there's actually been some studies in swimmers to show that for example, the last 50 meters of a 400-meter race, you can actually swim a little bit faster when you take creatine. And that was a short-term creatine study as well. So there is some evidence that creatine can enhance swimming performance.
So that performance increment in the last 50 meters was a loading period?
Yeah, so they just loaded with creatine for, I believe it was 7 days. And they showed that the last 50 meters of a 400-meter swim was performed faster with creatine.
Oh, awesome. So next question is the same person. He asks, in older adult above 90 years that is involved just in daily activities, how much creatine must take and how long?
Yeah, so I'd recommend that Candow method, where you take 0.1 grams per kilogram of body weight per day of creatine. So depending on his body weight, or her body weight is how much creatine you would take. So let's say they're 80 kilograms, that would be 8 grams of creatine per day. And then again, I recommend if they're looking for the muscle effects, you can see those relatively quickly. But if you're trying to look at some bone adaptations, which could be a benefit for that population, or the cognitive effects, you might have to take it for a little bit longer period of time. And I would recommend in that population to take it daily to get those benefits.
All right, and just to add up to that question, I just saw a study. It was a review by you and others that a larger dose of creatine, like 8 grams, is required for some bone benefits, but with resistance training.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's important for that individual to exercise as well. And even somebody who's 90 years of age should perform some resistance training. It might look a little bit different than how I might resistance train, but it's important to do some strengthening exercise in that population.
All right, so yes, that's awesome. So we have just 3 more questions. How much creatine are you taking, and what's your personal experience taking it?
That's a great question. So I take creatine after I train, and I mix it with protein. So I train 5 days a week in the gym, and I just consume creatine on the days that I actually train. So on the weekends, I don't consume it, and I just take 5 grams of creatine. But my scoop is not very accurate. So it might be slightly more than 5 grams, but I'm just taking creatine mainly for the muscle performance perspective. As I get older, maybe I'll start to up my dose slightly to increase the bone adaptations. But I feel like it just provides a little bit more energy in the gym, and it helps with my focus. And it's based off the research, it's an effective supplement. So maybe I have a placebo effect because I think creatine works, but the evidence also supports that creatine actually works as well. So yeah, I'm a believer of creatine, and I don't know. Can you see my
Creatine is a miracle supplement.
not a miracle, a small effect? Yeah.
That's for 2025, Mr. Olympia.
Yeah.
Another question: what do you think that some say that creatine is an overrated supplement?
So I think that it has many benefits within the body beyond just muscle performance. It can help your bones, can help your brain, can help your heart. But it's also important to understand that, as I mentioned, you're trying to build a cake. You need a solid foundation. So if somebody is not exercising regularly, if they're not getting good sleep, if they're not eating enough, good foods, then yeah, the supplement is not going to work. And so that's, I think people think that the supplement is going to make you into Mr. Olympia by 2025, which is not true. So it only has a small effect. It has a positive effect, but yeah, so lots of people say that creatine is going to have these really profound effects, but I think it's important to understand what the science actually shows.
Perfect. Do you recommend a particular brand of creatine supplement?
I don't. The brand that we use in most of our research it's actually called CreaPure, and it's not actually a brand, it's a manufacturer of creatine. And so we know that supplement has been tested and is very effective in the research world. So that would be one thing to look for is CreaPure, and many different brands use that particular manufacturer. So that would be my recommendation. But to be honest, other brands or other manufacturers are just as effective and can also enhance all these muscle, bone, and brain benefits as well.
Yes, as long as a high quality creatine monohydrate, that will be fine.
Absolutely.
¿Quieres una más?
Perfect. The last one, that's okay. Does creatine causes constipation or some other gastrointestinal discomfort?
So there are some people that have like an upset stomach when they take creatine. It's very rare, but it is possible, and this has been reported in the literature. And it seems to be more common during the loading phase. So when you're taking that 20 grams of creatine per day, there seems to be more individuals with GI distress. And so I recommend for anyone that has kind of a sensitive stomach, just to take a lower dose of creatine.
The last one, because it's very interesting, that question is there any disease or condition where the use of creatine is contraindicated? For example, renal ichthysis.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think the current recommendation is if somebody has like chronic kidney disease, to speak to their doctor and maybe don't take creatine. But there's actually some evidence, and we were talking about this before, that during dialysis, it actually removes a bunch of the amino acids, and you lose creatine from your body during that process. And so I know there's some current research going on looking at creatine supplementation in individuals receiving dialysis. So once we have more information on the safety of creatine with people with kidney problems or renal problems, then perhaps we can change some of our recommendations. But yeah, without the data right now, I just suggest if somebody has kidney disease or their kidneys are damaged in any way, then I would suggest not to take creatine.
Yes.
Perfect.
Yes, exactly.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Kratin. It was an awesome presentation. And thank you all guys for
Being here. Por estar aquí.
Gracias a todos por estar aquí. And we'll see you in the next presentation. Thank
Sounds
you,
good.
Doctor.
Thank you so much. We will keep contact on Gmail, on
Instagram.
to make the payment and all of that.
Sounds great. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much. Goodbye.
Ciao.
Ciao. Bye.